So part 5 of the muscular system, we're going to be looking at the contraction types and how we get the energy. So some more terminology. Muscle tone is the constant, slightly contracted state of all muscles, which does not produce active movements. It keeps the muscles firm, healthy, and ready to respond to a stimulus, and contributes to joint stability, for example, over the coxal joint. Spinal reflexes account for muscle tone by acting one motor unit and then another, responding to activation of the stretch receptors in the muscles and the tendons. We also have different types of muscles in that we can have an agonist, which is the prime mover. So it is the one that does the bulk of the work. We can have an antagonist, which opposes. Typically, in this case, it's going to be the prime mover. And we can have a synergist, which assists the prime mover by affecting the same movement or stabilizing the joints. So we have a number of different types of contraction. So remember that contraction refers to the activation of those actin and myosin cross bridges, which are the force generating sites. Shortening only occurs when the tension generated by the cross bridge exceeds the force opposing the shortening. Contraction ends when the cross bridges become inactive, the tension generated will decline and relaxation is induced. So we have three main types of contraction. The first one is an isotonic contraction. This is broken up into two. The first one is concentric contractions. It's a type of muscle contraction in which the muscle shortens whilst generating force and overcoming the resistance. For example, when lifting a heavy weight, a concentric contraction of the biceps would cause the arm to bend at the elbow, lifting the weight towards the shoulder. Cross-bridge cycling has occurred, shortening the sarcomere, the muscle fibre, and ultimately the muscle. Another type of isotonic contraction is an eccentric contraction. This results in an elongation of the muscle while the muscle is still generating force. In effect, resistance is still greater than the force generated. Eccentric contractions can be both voluntary and involuntary. For example, a voluntary eccentric contraction would be the controlled lowering of that heavy weight raised during the concentric contraction. Lastly, we have isometric contractions. This is where we have an increased muscle tension, but the muscle does not shorten during the contraction. The tension increases to the muscle's capacity, but the muscle neither shortens nor lengthens. It often occurs if the load is greater than the tension the muscle is able to develop. An example of this would be pushing against a wall. You have activated the muscle, but they have not shortened because you cannot overcome that load. So muscles obviously need energy, and their metabolism involves both ATP and ADP. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and it provides the energy for contraction. Well, in actual fact, it is removing of a phosphate that releases the energy. ADP is what we result in adenosine diphosphate. So stored ATP provides energy for cross-bridge mount and detachment, as well as operation of the calcium pump. ATP is the only source used directly for contractile activity, and it must therefore be regenerated as fast as it is broken down. As soon as the available stores of ATP are hydrolyzed or used up, which takes about 4 to 6 seconds, they are regenerated by 3 different ways. The interaction of ATP with creatinine phosphate, anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobic respiration. Let's have a look at those in a little more detail. Creatine phosphate, like ATP, is stored in muscle cells. When it is broken down, a considerable amount of energy is released, so it is considered a high energy molecule. The energy released is coupled to the energy requirement necessary for the resynthesis of ATP. However, the total muscular stores of both ATP and CP are small. This is, however, an instant transfer of energy. We have creatine phosphate plus ADP becomes creatine plus ATP. This type of energy production is used for very short-term durations, like 15 seconds for things like weightlifting. The second type of energy or ATP production is called anaerobic glycolysis. This is when muscle contractile activity reaches about 70% of the maximum. The bulging muscles start to compress the blood vessels, which means that the oxygen delivery is impaired, creating an anaerobic environment. Glucose undergoes glycolysis, liberating 2 ATP molecules and the formation of 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Pyruvic acid is then converted into lactic acid. The lactic acid diffuses into the bloodstream, is picked up and used as fuel by the liver, kidneys, and heart, and is later converted back to pyruvic acid by the liver. Anaerobic glycolysis is used for mid-range activity, so lasts up to 30 to 60 seconds and is in events such as the 400 meters. The last way to make ATP is via an aerobic pathway. We utilize this process at rest and during light to moderate exercise. In fact, 95% of all ATP is produced by this process. It also generates a large amount of ATP molecules, with around 36 ATP molecules being produced from a variety of sources such as fatty acids, amino acids, and glycogen. We can continue to utilize this pathway until our fuel stores are depleted, and an example is running a marathon.